The Young and the Restless Spoilers. For a long time, Nikki simply stood there in silence, staring at the DNA results trembling in her hands, unable to breathe. The papers she held confirmed what her heart already knew, but her mind still fought to deny: Matt was her son. The test results left no room for doubt, no scientific loophole to escape through. It was a cruel kind of truth, the kind that didn't bring peace but shattered everything that had once seemed unshakable. Her fingers tightened around the document as if crushing it could change its meaning, but nothing could erase the words printed in stark black and white. Matt watched her closely, every heartbeat of silence between them more excruciating than the years he had spent in the dark. For all his anger, he had imagined this moment would feel like justice, but instead it felt like the ground beneath him had vanished. The woman before him wasn't a legend anymore, not the untouchable socialite or the face of perfection that Genoa City worshipped. She was human, trembling, guilty, and real. He could see himself in her eyes, in the faint tremor of her breath, in the way her heart seemed to break as she looked at him. For a fleeting second, it didn't matter how much pain had come before. They were mother and son, and for the first time in decades, they weren't alone. But the illusion of comfort lasted only moments before the next question shattered it. Matt, still reeling from the confirmation, asked the only question that mattered now. He wanted to know who his father was. The idea had haunted him his entire life, the missing half of his identity, the source of the anger that had consumed him. The question hung in the air, heavy, unavoidable. Nikki froze, her body rigid, her eyes wide with something close to terror. She had expected this, dreaded it, rehearsed every possible way to deflect it, but none of them could survive his gaze. The truth was too complicated, too dangerous, and too bound to the fragile power structure of Genoa City. When he asked if it was Victor, a part of her almost wished it were. That would have been the simpler answer, the cleaner lie. But the truth, once spoken, could never be undone. Nikki shook her head, her lips barely moving, the weight of the confession pressing down on her chest like a stone. The words came out quieter than a whisper, yet loud enough to echo through generations. No, Victor was not his father. His father was someone else entirely. The silence that followed was unbearable. Matt's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, then to fury. He felt as if the world had played another cruel trick on him. All his life, he had believed he was nobody. Then for one bright moment, he thought he might be a Newman, powerful, untouchable, finally belonging to something bigger than himself. But now even that illusion was gone. He wasn't a Newman. He was something else, someone else's secret. The question burned hotter than ever: if not Victor, then who? And why had Nikki kept it buried for so long? The air seemed to thicken between them as he demanded to know. Nikki turned away, unable to meet his eyes, because the truth she had carried for decades was not just shameful, it was catastrophic. She had lived with it hidden under layers of denial, sealed away behind years of distance and polished lies. But her son was standing there, and she could no longer hide behind the facade of society or the protection of her last name. He deserved to know. Even if it destroyed them all. When she finally spoke, her voice broke like glass. The name came out slowly, like a confession dragged from the deepest corner of her soul. Jack Abbott. The world seemed to stop. For Matt, the name was a thunderclap, the rival empire, the eternal enemy of the Newman dynasty, the man Victor had fought for decades in boardrooms and backrooms, in love and in war. Jack Abbott, the polished face of Jabot, the symbol of everything Victor despised. The man whose name had hovered on the edges of Nikki's life for as long as anyone could remember. Matt could barely comprehend it. His knees weakened as the realization sank in: he wasn't a Newman at all. He was an Abbott. His veins carried the blood of the enemy. The revelation twisted everything he thought he knew about himself, about his purpose, about the woman who had given him life. He looked at Nikki with something between awe and horror. Every story he had heard growing up about the feud between the Newmans and the Abbotts now became a cruel reflection of his existence. He wasn't part of one side or the other, he was the living bridge between them, a secret the world was never meant to discover. Nikki couldn't bring herself to look at him at first. Her mind spiraled back to those long-forgotten years, the lonely nights when she had sought comfort in Jack's kindness, when her marriage to Victor was falling apart under the weight of ambition and pride. Jack had been the one who saw her not as a symbol but as a woman, fragile and real. Their love had been forbidden, a stolen chapter in a book already written by fate. When she learned she was pregnant, panic had replaced passion. She was already entangled in Victor's world, and there was no way to reveal the truth without detonating everything. So she had made the impossible choice, to disappear, to hide the pregnancy, to let others handle what she couldn't bear. The doctors had told her the child was stillborn, and she had believed them because believing anything else would have destroyed her. But now, decades later, the past had come back, demanding payment in full. Every lie, every compromise, every illusion of control had led her to this moment. And the cost was her son's trust. Matt's thoughts spiraled into chaos. The irony was almost poetic. The child of Nikki and Jack, two lovers bound by secrecy, raised in abandonment, returning to the city that had been built on the rivalry of his bloodlines. He was the ultimate contradiction, the embodiment of everything Genoa City had spent half a century fighting over. In his veins ran the conflict itself, Newman ambition and Abbott pride, fire and restraint, power and morality. And as much as the revelation destroyed him, it also gave him clarity. For the first time, he understood why his life had been a war. He wasn't cursed, he was born of conflict. He wasn't just a lost soul, he was the consequence of choices made in boardrooms and bedrooms long before he was old enough to speak. The tragedy was that he had never been given the chance to be anything else. Now he stood at the crossroads of his own identity, torn between vengeance and redemption, between the family that abandoned him and the one that never knew he existed. Nikki tried to reach him, to explain that what she had done was out of fear, not cruelty. But Matt couldn't hear her. Every word sounded like an excuse. He wanted to scream, to destroy something, to find Jack and demand the truth from him. Did Jack know? Had he ever suspected? Or had he, too, been deceived by silence? Nikki begged him not to confront Jack yet, not until she had the chance to prepare him, but Matt was already unraveling. He didn't care about the consequences anymore. He needed to look the man in the eyes and see what kind of father could live a lifetime without knowing his son was alive. The more Nikki tried to stop him, the more desperate he became. Her fear grew, not just for the scandal that would erupt but for the storm she saw in his eyes. The same anger that had once driven him to destroy others now aimed at the man who had unknowingly given him life. In the days that followed, Nikki lived in a state of suspended dread. Every hour felt like waiting for a bomb to detonate. She knew Jack's world as well as her own, knew how fragile the balance between him and Victor truly was. If this secret came out, it wouldn't just destroy relationships, it would ignite a war unlike anything Genoa City had ever seen. The Newman and Abbott families had spent decades in a cycle of competition and betrayal, but this revelation would turn that rivalry into something primal. Blood was no longer metaphorical. It was literal. Matt was the child of both houses, the proof that no wall could truly divide them, and that realization would terrify both patriarchs. She imagined Victor's reaction, the disbelief, the fury, the sense of humiliation. And Jack, the man who had always carried regret for the love he lost, would be forced to confront a reality that rewrote his entire life. Somewhere, she hoped he would forgive her. But she knew him too well. He would forgive her heart, but not the lie. Meanwhile, Matt began his own silent investigation, tracing Jack's past, studying his face, his history, his reputation. The more he learned, the more conflicted he became. Jack was not the monster he had expected. There was warmth beneath the ambition, a humanity he couldn't reconcile with his own bitterness. And yet, there was also a strange familiarity, a sense of recognition that went beyond logic. He saw pieces of himself in Jack's charm, in his intelligence, in the loneliness that lingered behind every success. The truth was undeniable. The man he should have hated most might have been the only one who could understand him. It was a revelation as painful as it was liberating. For the first time, Matt wondered whether he had inherited not just Jack's features but his heart, the same restless yearning for something real in a world built on appearances. When Nikki finally gathered the courage to tell Jack herself, it was too late. Matt had already found him. The meeting between father and son would change everything. But for now, Genoa City slept in ignorance, unaware that history was about to be rewritten again. The rivalry that had defined generations was about to collapse under the weight of one secret child. And in that quiet before the storm, Nikki sat alone with the DNA papers still in her trembling hands, whispering the name of the son she had lost, and the man she had loved. The past had returned, and there was no way to silence it anymore. The war between Newman and Abbott would never be the same, because now, through Matt, it had become a family affair written in blood. The revelation rippled through Genoa City like a curse spoken aloud after decades of silence. For years, people had whispered about Nikki's mysterious past, but no one had ever imagined that the truth could be this catastrophic. Matt was not a Newman. He was not the son of the Empire's patriarch, not the long-lost heir of Victor's dynasty. He was an Abbott. The irony was almost biblical. The bloodlines of two warring houses that had spent half a century locked in rivalry now intertwined in a single man who had grown up believing he was unwanted by both. Nikki's secret, kept buried beneath layers of guilt and denial, had now come to light in the most devastating way. She had once believed that burying her sin would protect everyone she loved, that surrendering her newborn to anonymity would allow her to return to Victor and rebuild her life. But secrets are living things, and this one had grown silently in the dark, waiting for the moment to destroy her peace. That moment had arrived the day Matt stood in front of her with the DNA test that confirmed everything she had tried to forget. Now, even as she struggled to breathe under the weight of her own choices, the question that hung in the air was no longer about guilt. It was about acceptance. Would Jack Abbott, the man who had once loved her and lost her, accept this living embodiment of their past? For Jack, the news arrived not as a whisper but as a storm. Nikki came to him privately, her face pale, her voice trembling, and in that moment, Jack's world fractured in silence. He had never known. He had never even suspected. Decades earlier, their affair had been brief but consuming, two wounded souls seeking refuge from lives that had grown too heavy. He remembered her laughter, the soft rebellion in her eyes, the way she had made him believe that love could exist outside the boundaries of wealth and family war. And then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. She returned to Victor, and Jack buried his feelings under ambition and pride. But now, standing before him, she told him that their affair had produced a child, a son who had been born, hidden, and cast into a world of strangers. The revelation tore through his composure like lightning through glass. He could not speak at first, could not think, could not even stand. Decades of rivalry, of pain and competition, collapsed into one unbearable truth. He had a son, and that son was the man who had appeared in Genoa City with anger in his heart and questions in his eyes. All those years of longing for legacy, for continuity, for a family beyond his fractured relationships, it had all been right there, denied to him by time and circumstance. Matt, for his part, felt like a ghost trapped between two mirrors. He had spent his entire life searching for an identity that kept changing shape. For a few fleeting weeks, he had imagined himself a Newman, a rightful heir to the power that had once crushed him. That illusion had given him direction. But now the truth left him stranded. He was not a Newman, not a reflection of Victor's empire, not a continuation of the family that had defined Genoa City for half a century. He was an Abbott, the son of the very man Victor despised most, the man whose name had been synonymous with competition, envy, and pride. It should have felt like victory, poetic justice delivered by fate itself, but instead it felt like punishment. He didn't know Jack, and yet his entire existence had just been rewritten in the shadow of his name. As the shock faded, a new hunger took hold of him, the hunger for belonging. For once in his life, he didn't want revenge or power. He wanted to know if he was worthy of being someone's son. Jack, though overwhelmed, couldn't ignore the pull of paternal instinct that slowly began to stir within him. He studied the young man's face and saw reflections of his own past, the same stubborn jawline, the same glimmer of defiance, the same charm that masked a lifetime of disappointment. But it wasn't just resemblance that shook him, it was recognition. In Matt's pain, Jack saw the echoes of his own youthful rebellion, the same need to prove oneself to a world that never seemed to care. And yet, for all that empathy, there was hesitation. Jack had made peace with many ghosts in his life, but this one demanded more than forgiveness. It demanded responsibility. Accepting Matt would mean reopening old wounds, confronting Victor again, and risking everything he had built at Jabot. Because once the city learned that an Abbott bloodline had crossed into Newman territory, nothing would ever be the same. The business world would see it as betrayal. The tabloids would see it as scandal, Victor would see it as war. Jack had to choose between silence and truth, and for the first time in years, he didn't know which one would destroy him faster. Nikki's anxiety grew with every passing hour. The reunion she had longed for had not brought her peace but a labyrinth of consequences. She watched Jack from afar, seeing the conflict raging behind his calm expression, and she knew what he was thinking. Jack had always been a man of heart as much as ambition, torn between love and legacy. The revelation of Matt's existence touched both wounds at once. Nikki feared that his pride would not allow him to accept a son born from secrecy and shame. And yet, deep down, she hoped that he would see what she saw, that beneath Matt's anger was a boy who had only ever wanted a family. She wanted redemption not just for herself but for the child she had lost. But she also knew Jack's moral code. He could forgive betrayal, but not deceit. And this, she feared, was the kind of deceit that might cost them both everything. When Jack finally agreed to meet Matt, the tension in the room was almost unbearable. Neither man spoke at first, but their silence said everything. Matt felt exposed, stripped of every mask he had ever worn. Jack, meanwhile, was staring at a mirror of choices he never knew he had made. The meeting was not filled with sentimentality or forgiveness. It was heavy, cautious, like two adversaries testing the ground before battle. Yet behind Jack's guarded demeanor was an ache he couldn't hide. For years, he had watched his siblings raise families, had mentored others' children, had buried his father and carried the Abbott name with pride. And all the while, he had never known that his own flesh and blood was out there, lost in suffering. He felt guilt, not for something he had done, but for what he hadn't known. And Matt, for all his defensiveness, sensed it. He had expected rejection, disgust, denial. What he saw instead was confusion and sorrow, emotions too real to fake. It was the first time in his life that someone had looked at him not as a threat but as something precious and fragile. But in Genoa City, peace never lasts long. The secret was too large, too explosive to remain contained. The whispers began in the hallways of Jabot, spread through Newman Enterprises, and by the end of the week, the entire city was talking. The forbidden child of Nikki Newman and Jack Abbott had returned, living proof that the feud between the families was built not just on competition but on blood. The shockwaves hit every corner of their lives. Victor's fury was volcanic. To him, it was not just betrayal but humiliation. The woman he had loved most had carried another man's child and hidden it for decades. Jack's enemies used the scandal as ammunition, questioning his integrity, his leadership, even his ability to separate personal life from business. Nikki found herself caught between two storms, the rage of the husband she had deceived and the fragile hope of the son she had rediscovered. Matt watched it all unfold with a numb detachment, realizing that his existence had become both a symbol and a curse. He was no longer just a man searching for truth, he was a headline, a scandal, a threat. Yet amid the chaos, something remarkable began to happen. Jack, despite the pressure and humiliation, couldn't turn his back on Matt. every instinct as a father, instincts he never knew he had, began to overpower his fear. He invited Matt into his world, cautiously at first, giving him a glimpse of the family he had been denied. It was awkward, tense, filled with missteps and misunderstandings, but it was real. The Abbotts, shocked and divided, struggled to process the news. Ashley saw danger, another secret that could fracture the family's fragile unity. Tracy saw possibility, a chance to heal old wounds. And Kyle, caught between loyalty and jealousy, didn't know whether to welcome or resist this new half-brother who threatened to change everything. But Jack stood firm. Whatever the cost, he couldn't deny his son again. He had spent his entire life fighting Victor for power. Now he realized that the only victory that mattered was reclaiming what life had stolen from him. For Nikki, watching father and son begin to find each other was both agony and relief. She had feared rejection, yet what she witnessed was grace, imperfect, hesitant, but undeniable. Still, she knew the danger was far from over. Victor's silence had become more frightening than his anger. The man who once ruled through emotion now moved with calculated restraint. He didn't shout, didn't accuse. He planned. For Victor, betrayal was not a wound to heal but an equation to solve. And somewhere in his mind, he was already plotting how to turn this humiliation into power.